topic today, right? When we look at all of the racialized incidents that have to do with the police department, that have to do with the vigilantes that assassinated our brother Ahmaud Arbery, it's important to kind of get a perspective on where this type of thinking comes from, right? That's why, the past few years I've been really big on learning the history of everything I can, really, but primarily the history of black people in this country, melanated people in this country. And when you do that, it gives you a clearer perspective of what you're seeing, which in my opinion makes it so you're not as reactionary. When you see things going on, you can more or less put together a plan or more or less contextualize what you're looking at in a way that doesn't make you as angry as prepared and determined to actually do something about it, right? So the beginning of the policing of black bodies in America started in like 1704 in the colony of Carolina, where they developed the nation's first slave patrol, right? Now, the main purpose of this was just to help maintain the economic order and assist the people who were wealthy in this country with recovering and punishing slaves when they done something wrong, right? Now, it's also important to note that slavery at the time, family, from the late 1600s to the 1800s, slavery was a fully institutionalized part of the American economy, right? And it was several laws that were enacted at both the state and the national level that made this the case. Just to give you an example, around that same time, Virginia enacted like 130 different slave statutes. And this was between like 1689 and 1865. And keep in mind, when I say slave statutes, family, I just mean rules and regulations that slaves had to follow, right? And that's exactly how it was. And this happened, and many people think that the slavery and the slave patrols and things of this nature was heavy in the South, which it was, but it was definitely heavy in the North as well, right? So Connecticut, New York, a lot of these states created these statutes to criminalize and control slaves, right? So that's important for us to understand. And also, around that same time, Congress passed like the fugitive slave laws that allow the detention of the return of enslaved slave, or the detention and return of slaves who escaped. And the slave patrols were interesting to me because just like we look at the assholes who killed Ahmaud Arbery, these are two white men who acted as vigilantes, right? But keep in mind, family, that in different states, when the slave patrols were enacted, white citizens, white men specifically, they were required to participate in the slave code, or they were required to participate in the slave patrols, right? And keep in mind, this was before police forces were formed. Police forcing would be formed later in like Boston, but the antithesis for future police forces, like the formation of it, how they begin to do their business, this started with slave patrols, where, men between, I think, 16 and 60 were called upon to actually act as police officers, basically. So this is giving them the right to be vigilantes. And they would do this by several means. They would travel around the town looking for any black folks that were gathered in groups. This is why today, I think when you see the no loitering signs, this is primarily for us. Even today, when we are in groups, we get a lot of shit we get fucked with a lot when we're in groups. We get harassed. They do what they can to break these groups up, right? Family, this is nothing new. This started way back then, where they would break up groups. They had the right, and these were citizens. This isn't police officers that we're talking about. This is just regular citizens that had the right to go in your house, check for anybody who was maybe an escaped slave. They were able to go through all your shit to see what you were doing. They checked to make sure you weren't reading, checked to make sure you didn't have any writing material. You feel me? Keeping in mind, at this time, a slave learning or attempting to get an education was an actual crime, right? And the slave patrol basically had three functions, which was to chase down and return slaves, provide organized terror and kind of do their best to deter slave revolts, and to, kind of maintain a form of discipline, right? So again, family, look at how we are policed today. Look at how the police react to melanated bodies. Look at how the police treat people in low income areas. And, when the slave patrols were instituted, of course, black people weren't the only poor people in the country at the time. So anyone who was poor was subject to this same treatment. And even when the police forces were newly formed, like around, I think in the late 1800s, when the police forces were formed, they were really, their initial job was more or less not stopping crime, but just making sure people were in the right place at the right time. It was just enforcing the protection of businesses. It was more or less just to protect what white folks had. It was to make sure we didn't fuck with their shit to a degree, right? Because they would make up all these stories that slaves were stealing shit and robbing people. So it became just enforcement of making sure we were where we supposed to be at all times, right? And the slave patrols, the slave patrols kind of died down like after the Civil War and, Reconstruction and all these things took place. But keep in mind, in my opinion, because of that mentality, because the government deputized citizens, I think that it just can continue to a degree. Because after the slave patrolling was done in like Boston, is when the first police forces were actually formed, and they had their racist intentions as well. But after the slave patrol is when we began to see groups like the KKK, who basically didn't want to abide to the new sentiments of the Reconstruction era, the Reconstruction era. Just as far as Reconstruction was just attempting to assimilate us back into society, and a lot of white people didn't like that fact. So they would form their own vigilante groups to kind of make sure we still stood in our place, right? And this would continue to happen. Like the antebellum slavery was really bad. I mean, the amount of years that it lasted, how we were treated, how black men had their balls cut off, and how they created slave bucks whose main job was to impregnate, hundreds of black women just to kind of produce a big slave, if you will, you know what I'm saying? So it was, black women getting hung by trees and getting their pregnant belly cut open and stepping on the fetus. Like, it was some really deplorable shit that we had to face. But you got to keep in mind, family, that when Jim Crow came about, which was supposed to be kind of giving us our freedom to a degree, again, like Reconstruction, kind of attempting to reinstitute us back into society, then we had the black codes that we had to deal with, where the black codes are basically different rules that we had to abide by. This is when you see, we can't drink at the whites only water fountain, whites only movie theater, whites only restaurant, right? So antebellum slavery was bad, but this shit was damn near just as bad. This wasn't a freedom. We were released, but once we were released, the Reconstruction era was probably about 10 years. And within this 10-year time, they seen, a lot of progress from us. We began to create our own businesses. We began to create our own community. So what they saw was when we were left to our own devices, we became pretty productive, right? We became effective and began to rely on ourselves because we knew nobody would help us. We knew that there wasn't many members in white society that was going to look out for us. You feel me? So we were really being prolific and doing for self. Then the black codes come and kind of just fuck everything up, right? And create an environment